They thought he was digging his own grave until the levee broke. There's a man in Missouri who spent 11 days digging a trench across his own backyard. His neighbors watched him from their porches. Nobody said anything at first, and somebody's wife started asking questions. Then somebody's husband started making jokes at the feed store. By the third day, half the county had a theory, and none of them were kind. They said Walter Briggs had lost his mind. They said grief does strange things to a man, and everybody knew what he'd been through that spring. They said he was digging a hole he didn't plan on filling with dirt. Nobody said it to his face, but everybody said it. And then on the 12th day, the Missouri River did something it hadn't done in 40 years. And the only reason half of Pike County still has a home to go back to is the hole they laughed at. This is the story of a man nobody understood until the water came. Walter Briggs was 61 years old, and he'd farmed the same 200 acres his whole life. His daddy farmed it before him. His granddaddy cleared it. That spring, Walter buried his wife of 38 years. Margaret had fought a long illness, the kind that takes its time, the kind that gives a man too many quiet nights to sit with what's coming. When she passed, the town did what small towns do. They brought casseroles. They said the right things at the funeral. And then, like always happens, they went back to their own lives, and Walter went back to an empty house. 3 weeks later, he started digging. Not a garden, not a foundation, a trench 4 feet deep, cutting a long, deliberate line across the low pasture behind his barn, angling toward the river. He didn't explain it to anyone. That was Walter's way. He'd never been a man who talked much, even before Margaret died, and after, he talked even less. So the town filled in the silence with its own story. By the second week, half of Pike County believed Walter Briggs had finally cracked. You have to understand something about small towns. When a man goes quiet, people get loud on his behalf. At the diner on Route 9, they said Walter hadn't been right since the funeral. At church, an usher pulled the pastor aside and asked if maybe somebody ought to check on him. One neighbor, a younger farmer named Denny Okafor, drove out there himself, parked his truck at the fence line, and just watched Walter work for 20 minutes before working up the nerve to walk over. "Walter," he said, "what in the world are you building out here?" Walter didn't stop digging. He wiped his forehead with the back of his glove and said 4 words. "Margaret told me to." And that was the moment the story really took off. Because to the town, that sounded like a man talking to his dead wife. That sounded like a man who'd finally lost his grip on what was real. Denny drove home that night and told his wife he thought somebody needed to call Walter's daughter in St. Louis. Nobody called Walter crazy out loud, but everybody started treating him like he might be. Here's what the whole county missed because nobody actually sat down and asked Walter the one question that mattered. Why there? Why that exact line? Margaret Briggs had grown up on that land too. Her father had farmed it before Walter's family ever bought the adjoining acres, and she'd told Walter more than he could count about the flood of 1986, the year the river jumped its banks and swallowed the Hutchins place 2 farms over, drowned their cattle, and took the west wall of their barn clean off its foundation. Margaret had watched that happen as a girl. She never forgot the sound of it. And in her last winter, lying in bed, weaker every week, she brought it up to Walter more than once. That river's going to come back one day. It always does. And when it does, I want you high and dry, Walter Briggs. Promise me you'll dig the swale like Daddy always talked about, the one that turns the water toward the culvert instead of through the pasture. Walter promised her. And 3 weeks after her funeral, alone in the quiet of a house that used to have 2 people in it, he picked up a shovel and kept the only promise he had left to keep. He wasn't talking to a ghost. He was finishing his wife's last request. He just wasn't the kind of man who explained himself to a county full of people who'd already made up their minds. 11 days after Walter started digging, the rain arrived, and it did not stop. 3 days of rain stacked on top of a snowmelt the county hadn't accounted for, and the Missouri River did what rivers do when nobody's paying attention. It rose, fast. By the second night, the water was already lapping at the edge of the low pasture, the same pasture Walter had been quietly reshaping for almost 2 weeks. Neighbors who'd laughed at him were now standing in their own yards in the dark, watching the water creep toward homes that never flooded before, not even in '93. But it never reached the Okafor's barn. It never touched the Hendricks place or the little rental house at the end of the lane, because Walter's swale did exactly what Margaret's father had always said it would do. It caught the overflow before it ever reached the low ground, and it funneled it, calm and controlled, straight toward the county culvert half a mile downstream. The water that should have poured through 6 properties instead poured through one man's trench exactly where he'd put it. By morning, Pike County had lost some crops, it had lost a stretch of fence line, it had not lost a single home. Denny Okafor stood at his fence line the next morning, looking at dry ground that should have been 3 feet underwater, and he didn't say a word for a long time. Then he drove to Walter's place. Walter was out checking the swale, making sure it had held. Denny didn't apologize, not exactly. That's not really how men like that talk to each other. He just stood next to Walter for a while, looking at the water moving where it's supposed to, and finally said, "Your wife knew what she was talking about." Walter nodded. She usually did. That was the whole conversation, and somehow it was enough. Word got around the way it always does in a small town, quietly through the diner and the feed store and the church parking lot, the same channels that had carried the whispers a few weeks before. Except this time, the story wasn't about a man losing his mind. It was about a woman who carried a hard memory for 40 years and a husband who trusted her enough to dig a trench nobody understood simply because she'd asked him to. We are so quick to explain away what we don't understand. A quiet man with a shovel becomes not right. A promise kept in silence becomes a rumor. It's easier to whisper a story than to walk over and ask a real question. Walter Briggs didn't need the town to believe him. He only needed to keep a promise to the one person who'd asked him to. And when the water finally came, it didn't ask the county for its opinion either. It just followed the path somebody had loved him enough to warn him about. If this story moved you, you know what to do. Hit subscribe because there are 100 more like it. Quiet people, overlooked promises, and the moments that prove them right. See you in the next one.